Welcome back to Me, My Bike and I. My name's Rich and this is a broken XV535 engine. My broken XV535 engine. In my last video I explained that whilst riding the engine died, the back wheel locked up and the bike skidded to a stop. So I took the engine out of the bike, I got her on the bench and we need to tear her down to find out what the issue is. I've tried to turn the crank over, it won't rotate in either direction. I don't think it's a transmission issue because the middle gear rotates okay. She's in neutral at the moment and she goes in and out of the gears okay, or at least she did while the engine was still in the bike. So I think it's a bottom end issue. So possibly a bearing cap or a rod or something like that might have dropped. Something majorly catastrophic is locking her up. First thing I'm going to do though, really quickly, is take this cover off. That cover has the oil pickup in it, and I just want to have a quick look at the strainer. I've had this cover off once already, as in loosened. I'd need tweezers, but all those little bits that you can see there are flakes of metal. You can see some pretty big curls of it right there. I don't know why this engine is not that high mileage, it's less than 15,000 miles on it, so there shouldn't be wear, flakes of wear on it really, not like that. Tricky bit with this is getting it to come away from the pull of the magnet. Cool. There's nothing. That's just the gear that goes onto the starter. The starter turns the big one, and the little one turns the starter clutch. Sits on that pin there normally, actually. So there's nothing in there that I can see I mean, well, you've got no real, apart from this, you've got no real moving parts in there anyway, but I'm not seeing any evidence of any. Ooh, hang on. There you go, if I hold it against a white background, look, you can see clearly a little piece of metallic mayhem nestled down in the stator cover. First piece of evidence of damage. A lot of this you can do with a basic toolkit, but I would just recommend with ratchets and things like that on the bigger fixings that you use the biggest square drive that you have available. 3/8 with something like this is probably the smallest you should go. If you go 1/4 inch on perhaps you've got a very small home DIY kit, you're probably going to snap those off these big old stuck fixings. So 3/8 is an absolute minimum really, otherwise you might come into some problems. This is the only other thing when you're trying to undo stuff on a bench on the... Yeah, pretty stuck. Need something to hold this engine, don't I? There we go. To get to the cam cover Allen bolts. I'm guessing they're 5mm. Just using an Allen key, but I don't think I'll have clearance, so let's have a look. Oh, yeah, it's okay. There you go. Right, so yeah, we're still on the front cylinder, front cylinder head. and I'm just taking the cam cover off. Just being really careful to keep everything together in the right order and bag everything up where possible so things don't stray. There you go. I'll need to clean all these threads up before reassembling the engine anyway, assuming we get that far. Okay, cam chain tensioner then. This is the thing that keeps your cam chain nice and taut. It runs, the cam chain runs on a sprocket on the crank, all the way up through the tunnel onto a sprocket on the end of the camshaft, and then a plastic guide sort of pushes against the chain to keep it all nice and tight under spring-loaded rod pressure. So this big bolt in the centre is what keeps the pressure on. These two little bolts here just keep it attached to the actual, in fact, the barrels itself. The tunnel, you call it, on this bike runs through well, it runs through the head and the barrels, and the actual tensioner attaches in this case to the barrel. So let's get this off. We need to do this bolt first. It's actually really good practice to loosen these with the engine in the bike, but I didn't, whatever. That wasn't even tight. I don't like with Allen keys is you have to wiggle them in sometimes. When I say Allen keys, I mean hex sockets. The last thing I'm going to do on the front cylinder block is take off the exhaust and the inlet rocker covers before I move on to the rear cylinder block. It is just a bit of a shame I can't check the valve clearances. I can't obviously do that because I can't get the engine into the right position. So, but it would just have been nice to see what the values were. But it's all coming apart anyway. They're going to get put back to the right clearance on reassembly. So yeah, doesn't matter. This is obviously a Yamaha thing. So most of those fixings I've taken off on the bike so far, including in the last video with the engine removal, have been, they weren't even tight, have been sort of Allen head bolts, as in sockets, hex sockets. All of these seem to be hex heads. That one seems to be tight. It's weird they just use such a funny mixture of different fittings. Who'd have thought Yamaha would be sort of worried about the cost of things and be sourcing out cheap parts, would you? But having said that, most of the fixings that come up here are so corroded. I think they probably did cheap out. Definitely my preferred style of valve train, where you've got essentially good old-fashioned rockers, and moreover adjustable rockers. So that adjuster in the middle that's also an Allen fitting, and then the lock nut around the outside. Way better than all these modern shim malarkey things. Just on the rear now. Much of the same. Get all these bits off, bag them up. just wanted to show you and explain the difference between the rear cylinder and the front cylinder cam chain sprocket. So that's the camshaft that runs through there. That's obviously the sprocket that chain sits on. You can see you've got this little baffle plate arrangement, and it's kind of, it looks like that on the inside of the cover. You've got no such arrangement on the front one. You can just see that's a plain cover, and you don't have this little plate either. You can see the sprocket clearly. The reason that's on there is to sort of baffle, muffle, retain all of the oil splash, if you like, because that there, which you only have on the rear cylinder on this engine, is the crankcase breather. The hose comes out of there and it goes up into where the airbox used to be on this bike before I took the airbox out and put a 2-to-1 side mounted carb on. So it just vents the crankcase as the crankcase compresses and decompresses. It gives the air somewhere to go and get drawn back into as the pistons go up and down. But you only have it on the rear block. They could have put it on the front block, they put it on the rear block. You don't need it on both because it's venting one crankcase, and it kind of just operates down through the tunnel. So anyway, I thought you might like to see that, just part of the interest in how an engine works and what's going on inside. That is so locked up. First one came off nice and easy. This one is stuck. I'm going to use the centre bolt without the spring, and I'm going to use this, which some of you might recognise as a kind of a spanner that's designed to tighten up the disc on an angle grinder. And I'm going to use this as a lever, and I'm just going to encourage it off that way. More secure. Shouldn't need too much. I just need to break the seal. It might have just been painted on, you know what it's like when you, here it goes, look at that, see, it's just about getting hold of it. Cam sprocket next. Mind your fingers, you end up bashing on something, you're going to wrap your knuckles and cut them up and all sorts. Right. So this is the baffle plate that I've just removed, which came off when I took the bolt out. Can you see that little pin there? That's a better close up. This pin here, when you turn the flywheel, this thing here, which is all locked up, which I can't obviously turn, you're meant to turn that, well, you turn it clockwise, which is the normal rotation of this engine from the left, and you get that little line there alongside the T, which is top dead center on the compression stroke for the rear cylinder, and you line it up with the little timing mark in the inspection hole in the cover right here. You just turn the flywheel with a spanner on the center nut, and it essentially puts that pin there lined up against that little timing mark there. None of this actually matters for just taking the cylinder head off. All I need to do now is undo the 5 nuts and bolts on the top, take the chain off the sprocket, pull the sprocket off, and it's free to move up and off the dowels on top of the barrel. But it does matter if once we've kind of dug down, we notice that the problem lies with the head and not actually in the crankcase itself, and we need to take the head apart. To take the head apart, I need to get that camshaft in the right position so that the lobes are away from the rockers. In other words, those valves would be closed as if the cylinder were in top dead center on the compression stroke. And to do that, all I need to do is stick a bolt back in the end of that camshaft and turn it on a spanner, and that's whether the cylinder head is on the engine or loose on the bench. And of course at the moment the only thing stopping me doing that is that it's locked up with the rest of the engine. So let's just pull this little sucker out. There you go. Making sure that little locating pin doesn't come out. I'm going to do now, very quickly, take these bolts back out, stick that cam sprocket bolt back in as I described, and then there you go. Turn that round so that is pointing towards the dowel is pointing towards the little locating pin. No, can't spin the nut off now, doesn't matter. That's fine. And you can see that's actually quite loose, that camshaft now. Can you see that? It's turning quite freely. Essentially that means there's no pressure on the cam lobes, so it will slide out when it needs to. You can hear that wobble wobble. You can hear that wobble wobble. Right, so I need to loosen these two Allen bolts here. 1, 2, 3, 4 nuts there, and there's a nut right down in the spark plug well there. I'm assuming these look bigger than the 5mm that I've been used to. So let's get the Allen keys on them, and I'm guessing they're 14 or 15. 14, I think. Quite literally an impact hammer. Just going to loosen this one down in the spark plug well before I loosen them right off. Let's see what this one does. Okay. And just take a note of which way these brackets come off. And don't lose your washers. Slip that chain off now. There she is. Spin this round and show you. There you go. So that's your cam chain tunnel. Change the slip down there, no big deal. Just let that drop down. So this is your tensioner. That's your guide rail. So that's the one that is put under tension with the cam chain tensioner that goes through there that you see us take out. That's what keeps it all nice and tight. This is your lovely piston crown, and to be fair, it's looking all right. It's just got a very light coating of carbon that will clean off, but you can see there's no damage whatsoever on that. That's absolutely fine. Your head gasket, which is coming off right now. So the head gasket is made up of 3 layers. If if I can just tease them apart and show you. You can reuse them, but it's always best to replace when you're doing something like this. Can you see that? There you go, see 3 layers. Sometimes they're separate, different materials. Sometimes they're actually almost like, I suppose, on better engines than this. I've seen them held together with tabs. They don't have any rotational symmetry whatsoever, so it can only go on one way. It will be the same on the rear as it is on the front. And it's important really that you get OEM, because if this diameter is too small, too big, if the thickness is not right, all of those factors will affect your compression ratio. What I find really strange is that it has one bolt down there. So yeah, I have no idea why you would put any bolts on if you're just going to put one bolt on, because that's asking for warpage. Obviously once the cylinder head's on and it's torqued down, fine, but why would you just torque down one bolt on one side? To me that makes no engineering sense whatsoever. But hey, what do I know? I'm not an engineer. Let's get it undone anyway. Very satisfying crack you get when you're undoing engine bolts. Let's take the guide rail out. So it just lifts out the actual tensioner one. That's on a pin for obvious reasons, and because it needs to pivot. Combustion chamber looking okay, so the piston crown looked fine, the cylinder bore looked okay, couldn't see any scoring or marks. This has just got a bit of carbon build-up, nothing major. I dare say these valves could do with reseating, just really lapping in. I will get a chance to have a good proper look at that spark plug thread hole there. You can see my little finger wiggling through there, can you? And because that's the one I repaired, but this will clean up nicely, no obvious damage there. So rear cylinder head, so far so good. Let's keep digging. Just like that. I know it's not the best viewpoint possible, but the bores look okay to me. There's no scoring or anything like that, not that I can see. Anyway, certainly nothing that's going to cause this engine a major problem. Just doing this bit by bit, I'm going to leave this piston on the rod for now, and I'm going to take the head and barrels off the front first. This is the front cylinder, and I have to say this is the one that did cause me more problems with oil fouling, or at least it was kind of, you know, wet plugs, that kind of thing. But again, the piston crown, it looks okay. It's just tarnished with a bit of carbon. I was expecting like lots of crud to be laying in there. There really wasn't anything. So far, nothing really wrong with the top end. Right, clutch cover, oil filter housing. we had one tight bolt there. I know these ones won't be too tight because I've undone them already once when the engine was in the bike, because these hold the clips to the cable that runs round the front to the starter motor. Oh, that one is not happy. Ah, it's rounded. Well, it's turning so gently as we go, but I've clearly rounded off the inside of that, and I'm going to need to be a bit careful. Right, well, with this little drama queen out of the way, we can spin off all the rest of the side cover bolts. So this one undid and then immediately locked itself up, so we've got a similar situation as to the stuck one that was down here. The issue is I don't want to, although it's a bit easy to get to, but I don't want to round the head off. Right, with all these threads, the internal and external threads, will get cleaned up with taps and dies. Nothing particularly to worry about in there. Not too happy that's got a plastic gear of any sort in there, and that's a lot of free play. So we don't know any more at the moment than we did when we started, just in the sense that it just doesn't turn. The flywheel, that side's all locked up, this is all locked up, and it should turn. There's literally no compression there clearly at the moment, and it's in neutral because you can see this turning, which means the output shaft is turning. So somewhere in there between the input shaft and the crankshaft and the clutch and the flywheel and all that kind of stuff, something is locking something up. I think I'm going to spin the flywheel off first. I can really show you with the light, but there was lumps of metal in there and all sorts of flakes, and this bolt just got absolutely... I mean, maybe it's just remnants of... do you know what it could be? It could just be remnants of Loctite or something like that. It's possible. Okay, I'm going to need a flywheel puller for this, which is an M10 by 1 1/4 bolt. Essentially you screw it all the way in until this goes pop, it breaks the taper. I don't have one, I'm going to need to order one, so we shall just spin the block around and deal with the clutch first. Didn't think they'd take much to crack off anyway, because they're only under 8 Newton meters of torque when you do them up. So with this one, you've got a rod that goes all the way through. There's a steel ball and a long rod. I need to pull them out, but I can't really get to them with a magnet at the moment. So I think I'll take the clutch boss nut off first, and then I can take the inner clutch housing off. Of this type, the rod pushes its way through as you pull the clutch, obviously separating the friction and steel plates and operating your clutch for you. So I just need to drive back this lock washer. You see, normally you'd leave the outer clutch housing in there and you'd have the bike in gear, which would stop this from turning, so that you could wedge a rag between the gears on the back of the outer clutch housing and the primary drive gear to stop this turning, so that you can undo this nut. But of course this ain't going to turn with the engine all locked up, so we haven't got that problem. Very damaged, but it's got a locating tab. Okay. It's like a kind of like a wood rough key. things don't tend to be difficult once you're inside the engine because they're not really subject to corrosion. Corroded. Corroded. Not corroded. Corroded. Okay. It's meant to just pull out, but that's not going to happen. I have fiddled with this for a while now, and this is pretty tight in here. It kind of sits inside the housing. It probably goes in a little way, and there's an O-ring there for oil sealing purposes. So that's not just going to pull out easily. I'm going to stick a slide hammer on here. See if we can do it that way. Okay, don't know if this is going to work. Nut, flanged nut, which is ideal. Pop that in there. A bolt of the same thread, size and pitch, and slide hammer. Stop that from turning. Okay, so let's give that a bit of a tug, see what happens. We can see some movement, so that's giving it a little, you can see some light appearing. Oh yeah, that's definitely moving. Most of the way out now, look, and it's just because I left the bolts in that's stopping it flying off and crashing into me, doing some serious rib damage. One middle gear. This is of course your output shaft, and you can see spinning freely. This is your input shaft where the clutch would be, because it would have a driven gear on the back of it that would be driven by what effectively would be the gear at the end of the crankshaft here, which ain't moving. So if I hold that side, can't really show you all at one time, I can turn this and my fingers are holding that gear there, it's not moving. It's in neutral. Yeah, it's all moving okay. So it would appear there's no transmission issue. The next thing we're going to do is take off the gear selector mechanism here. We're on the right hand side of the engine. I'm behind the engine essentially. So this is the end of the selector rod, so you'd have your gear change pedal on the other side, and every time you shift down or up, this will rotate clockwise or anti-clockwise, moving this mechanism either up or down. And then this little thing here is what pushes it round or pulls it back, but also keeps it locked in place on that hook. Behind here you've got a torsion spring, you can see the ends of it there, captive on that bar, and that's essentially whether this goes up clockwise or down anti-clockwise is what returns it back to its position. These lobes behind, or at least the troughs in between, effectively are your first, second, third, fourth, fifth gear, and one of these peaks has a little indentation in it which is between first and second gear, and that will be your neutral. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of this, and I simply do it by extracting it, and the rod should come through the engine. We just need to go to the other side to remove the circlip, and then that should freely move away. It flew off, but it didn't fly too far. I need to shift that down as well, it's on the end of the torsion spring. So that's essentially what sits in your... There you go. So this little wheel here, which is under tension with that torsion spring against the frame, is what sits inside the end of the shift cam lobes here on the end of the shift drum. And they correspond to your first through to fifth gear, and you can see just on that one there it's actually indented, and that's between first and second gear. Essentially that is your neutral. When the engine is apart and I'm ready to take this drum out, I just need to align these with the slots there so that it will just pass through freely, but that's when we're ready to get it out. It won't come out this way, it's got to go out that way when the cases are apart. Now this, right, time to get the stator off then, and I'm going to need to use a puller. Some of them you just need a single bolt through the middle if you've perhaps got threads on this on the inner portion of this boss. This one doesn't, so I need this type of puller with a little pointy end that will just sit on the end there, and as I wind it in it'll pull this plate back, and these bolts will be just fitted into these little threaded bolt holes here, and the plate will be pulling back on those, and it should just pop it off its taper. Right, I've found a third bolt that's much longer, so I'm using some spanners as spacers so that there you go. So that plate should meet equidistantly. This is always a very disconcerting process. Satisfying though. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see it, there's just a little wood rough key there, which I need to take out and keep safe, and then I can slide this gear off. You can see now it spins both ways because it's not attached to the starter starter gear mechanism. And I'm starting to notice what might look like a problem, but it might have been one I've created, so I'm not sure. Okay, so I'll call this a wood rough key. What other names does it have? Anyway, take that out, keep that very safe. Good job I saw that go. Now I do think this is a red herring, because what you're looking at is the cam chain that's wrapped around the crankshaft sprocket and locked into itself. I don't think that's the cause of this engine locking up. Now when I first started stripping this engine down, this cam chain was firmly sat on the camshaft sprocket and the crankshaft sprocket at the same time, and there was plenty of tension in it. Only when I released the cam chain tensioner did it relax a little bit. I can't believe that there was so much slack in that chain with it sat on both those sprockets that it would be able to lock itself up like that and stop the engine. I think that's just dropped down into the engine as I've been working on it, and as I've been wiggling the stator, it's just gone and got itself all locked up. So the only thing to do is get this tensioner off, just them 2 bolts there, and then see if we can pull this free. These are not generally tight because they're only going to be about 10 or 12 Newton meters or something like that. Just glad that no one's gone and bunged a load of thread locker in. Although I'd imagine these bolts would have been last fitted at factory. When you're doing things like clutches and stuff like that, of course, many owners of this bike would have perhaps had those bolts on and off many times. And consequently use thread locker to put them back. So just as a last check that it is still locked up inside, push and pull on the piston, nothing moving. I've put the stator bolt back in the end of the crank, and it just keeps tightening. So, time to separate the halves. Okay, so this is not going to be as straightforward as it looks. From looking from the front, most of the bolts come in from the right hand side, here, and as you go underneath, here, all the way through to the back, and then you spin it round. You've got a bolt there which is all on the right hand side, and as you spin it round you've just got 2 bolts on the other side, which is fine, I presume, because you've got the middle gear housing in the way, so you just need it to come in from this side. That's all straightforward, but what isn't straightforward is this. If you watched my last video, you'll recall I had great difficulty removing this bolt out of here, and as you can see it's still in there. You've just got the nut on the end of this threaded portion and the head sheared off the other end. Now this is at the very front of the engine, and this bracket holds the hangers that holds the foot pegs, the gear changer and the brake pedal. If it's corroded all the way through, it's going to stop those cases separating, and then what I'm going to have to do is take an angle grinder there, cut right through the middle of where the cases join and separate the bolt that way. I'll still have a problem getting the bolts out, of course, and I need to do that because I've got to re-hang the hangers. But I am hoping, of course, that it's just corroded at one end or the other, so the cases still separate, and that way I haven't got to cut through the case to cut the bolt. I can just cut the bolt off later. Anyway, I'm going to get the case bolts all loosened first, and try to go around and do it crisscross. Actually, I've already loosened the lower ones because I had to release the starter motor cable. we shall just whiz round. So oddly, some of them are 6mm head and some are 5. Just going to get some impact on that one. Loose. Get it seated in there first. I suddenly realised this is the other side of the engine, these aren't the ones I loosened. Loose. These are going to be dead tight as well. Right. Don't think there's anything I've missed. Okay, so I've got pry points here, which you can get a drift behind. I've got one there. I've got one right there where the cases join where that stock bolt is. There's one down there. So there's plenty of places that you can give it a bit of a wiggle and a tap. But this is the place where I'm most concerned about. So can't see any movement between those two halves when I do that. But I can on this end, so do you know what I think I'm going to do before I do anything else is throw a load of heat on that and see if I can get this out. Yeah, it's not moving. I am actually a firm believer in going hammer and tongs at things without letting common sense get in the way. And this hammer isn't working. Still see a little bit of bolt left. I'm just going very gently and slowly. I don't want to go cutting right through into the engine, into the crankcase. That would be a disaster. But at least I can tell while I've got sparks, I've got steel. You'll be able to see this better once I've got the crankcases separated, but I think as you can see there, we've just got aluminium, no steel bolt left, and I should be able to take them apart. I have gone a bit ski with, but I am not worried about that. Well, I hope you don't think that was too mad, and what the hell, I've created myself a new pry point as well. You know, if there was one reason, and one reason alone, why this engine now needs to come apart, it's because it's going to be absolutely filled full of iron filings, and that ain't good for engines. Now some people are cleverer than they look, and some of us just look cleverer than we are. I'm going to take the last 2 case bolts out, and then we're going to get these puppies apart. I've got one there, and I've got one in there, and yeah, I missed them. This one's a 5mm hex socket, so because it's inside the engine, I didn't look for it, and at least it hasn't got a load of muck and gunk in the head. So see if we can get a pull on that. That's that one. And I believe the other one's a 6. Well, it looks like a 6 anyway. Just use a short one. I think it'll be easier. No, it won't go in. Impact drivers aren't just for stuck bolts, they also play a part in moving bolts where you just can't hold on to what you're trying to undo. Right, well, that should make it a little easier. Oh, now I can see them moving. What a fool when I broke that off. About good and done, ready to fall apart now. Still quite weighty, even though a lot of the engine's been removed, so try and stop them slipping down. Okay, this is the right hand side case, the one we lifted off. This is the front, this is the rear. So that's the plain bearing where the crankshaft would go through. This is where the output shaft would go, and this is just the bearing that the input shaft sits on at that end. Now you can see these are perfectly free, no issues there. That one's slightly less free, but I can turn it quite easily with my fingers, not a problem at all. That plain bearing there looks absolutely fine, and clearly that end of the crank just pulled out without any kind of issue, so I can't imagine that caused us any problems. So with this right hand side case, there really is nothing to see, and I don't think there's anything at fault. There's lots of gunk and gloop down the bottom, but that's to be expected for an engine of this age. You're never going to get all that out with an oil drain. Now it's always difficult to demonstrate this when you haven't got an engine running, because as you know, generally you need to have it running to be able to change gear, but it doesn't really matter. You can see all of these turn freely, and I can turn the selector drum quite easily, and everything moves as it should. It goes through all the gears without any kind of problem. And of course, there's absolutely no physical connection between the transmission and the crank on the inside of the engine. All of the drive takes place on the outside, when you've got the primary drive gear on here, and you've got the driven gear here on the back side of the clutch. So I think just from this very brief look, we can see that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the transmission, or at least this isn't what's causing us a problem. The issue, therefore, clearly lies in the crankshaft assembly. So I can't see anything obvious at the moment. I was expecting perhaps to see maybe one of the caps that have come off the end of the rod on the big end, something like that. They're all intact. There's nothing broken off, dropped off, that's in the way, wedging between something. It just won't turn. The only thing that connects this assembly to the case is the bearing that it runs through. So I'm assuming at this stage that that is where the problem lies. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to take these pistons out. Now I can get to both of them because this one was slightly down. I couldn't get the gudgeon pin out, and I'm going to get these out of harm's way because these are obviously very delicate and they're not in the protective casing of the barrels. So I'm going to get those off, put them away, mark them up so I know which cylinder they came out of, and then we're going to try and extract this crank from the case. Annoyingly, these aren't regular circlips. They're just plain with no eyelets on the end. There you go, it's come out fine. Hard up it won't. Driving out from the other side maybe, but I can't quite get to it because the piston's down. Normally you'd move the piston up. Oh, it's coming, it's fine. So I'm just going to pop this in a bag and mark it front. I won't be marking which side is exhaust and which side is intake because the valve reliefs tell me that, because this one is smaller than that one and I can actually clearly see the EX mark. It's one of them things where you probably just need to replace it if you buckle it up. So a quick check of the con rods then. There's no up or down movement on either of them, so they're absolutely fine on their bearings. There's a bit of backwards and forwards lateral movement, so I'm going to check to see whether that's within tolerance. There should be some, but not a great deal. And of course they do move freely around the crank pin, so they're fine. This should just come straight out. It should not be stuck. It should not need any amount of force. So I suspect we have a seized bearing there. So I'm going to need to persuade this out from this side. I wonder if I should take all these transmission shafts out first. I think I should. That one says R, that one says L, that one says C, and all of these pins are to the bottom. Snap ring to come off. There's a little thrust washer in there skulking, that's got to come off as well. Yeah, fiddly little thing. I think we'll go and find that first. Right, unfortunately that hadn't gone too far. Thrust washer. And then the very final gear being second gear. I'm going going to leave this in here for the moment because nothing's going to fall out. It's actually got retaining clips there. Okay, so we now know the issue is with the plain bearing at this end of the crank. So to explain what the problem is, I'll show you the other end because you'll be able to see the bearing very clearly. So you can see you've just got this plain shell bearing inside. It's got this groove all around the inside, runs all the way around. It's got these little oiling holes. You've got this oil gallery here that comes down. You've got this oil gallery here that goes down there to the bottom of the engine. Oil comes in and out and around and it lubricates the crankshaft. You've also got this little tab here which locates into this little slot here, and it stops this bearing from spinning. So this one's all fine, and clearly the crankshaft just came out of it without any problems. But on the other side we can clearly see what's gone wrong. So you can see that this bearing is actually spun, and that locating tab is about 30 degrees from where it should be. So that's wedging it in there, and additionally it would have closed up those oil holes for the galleries. So that's going to have caused a bit of overheating. So I think that's just a combination of wedged and overheated, and it's basically jammed it in there. So I'm going to need to try and force this thing out now. Whether I just try and knock this bearing back to take a little bit of pressure off it where that little tab's bent over, or just try and push it through. Haven't quite decided yet. Probably take a few different techniques, I would imagine, as always, but we shall get this out. And then I do have a new bearing on order, and once we've got that we should just be able to get her all refitted and back together. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the strip down of the Yamaha Virago XV535. I set out to find out why it was seized. Turns out it's that plain bearing on the end of the crankshaft on the left side, the stator side. It's spun out and it just needs replacing. I'm going to have a little bit of fun and games driving that out, no doubt, but I will do that off camera. And in the next video I will be rebuilding the engine and getting it back in the bike. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and I will see you on the next one.